Hello and welcome, friends. I hope everybody's having a great day so far. If you are new here, welcome. And if you're back, welcome back. I greatly appreciate all of the ongoing support. This is my channel, Dragonsjewel Creative Gems, and I'm Tegan, and I'm just going to get all that wonderful YouTubey stuff out of the way first. If you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, please consider doing so. It's just down below there. And of course, any love, comments, suggestions, all those wonderful things, there's that comment section down there. And don't forget to hit that like button as well. Today we are going to be doing our Ghostly Echoes series, and we had been going through the province of Alberta. I have now finished up Alberta, and we are moving west to British Columbia, also known as BC. So those will be the next series of ghost stories that we'll be covering starting this episode. We'll see how far we get with those, and I hope you guys enjoy these next few spooky tales. This story takes place in Victoria, British Columbia. A wicked wraith. Malicious poltergeist activities took place during August 1938 in a house somewhere on Uplands Road in the Oak Bay suburb of Victoria. The exact address of this temporarily haunted house and the full names of those who resided in it at the time of the hauntings are recorded in my files. However, out of consideration for the home's current owner, who probably has no idea what ever happened on his valuable property, I have minimized the number of clues as to its identity. I might not have been so careful to do so if this ghost story was not one of the most venomous that I've ever been told. For the reason that I mentioned, the identification of the cast of unfortunate characters in this tale will be limited to first names. Harry was a prominent lawyer who had just married Edith, an accomplished pianist 10 years his junior. After the honeymoon, Harry would not need to make much in the way of adjustment to married life. Not only was the couple moving to the large house where Harry had been raised, but even the family's loyal maid, Mary, had happily agreed to stay on. Edith was looking forward to using the hours while her husband was at work to settle into her new home, a process that included developing some rapport with Mary. Although she couldn't pinpoint exactly why, Edith felt an atmosphere of hostility in the large, luxurious home. In fact, nearly 40 years after she moved in, Edith was quoted as having known right from the start that hate was abroad in the house. As there were certainly no bad feelings between her and Harry, Edith deduced that she was sensing Mary's resentment at the arrival of another woman into the household. Wanting to resolve the situation, Edith was prepared to accept Mary on any terms that the maid wished to establish. But as it would later turn out, it was not Mary's energy that she was sensing. However, it would take her a while to realize that the malicious going-ons to come were not Mary's doing, but the actions of an evil poltergeist. Shortly after Edith moved in, strange things began to happen. Initially, she found pictures on the wall that she knew had been hanging straight just moments before were suddenly askew. An annoying occurrence, yes, but far from a threatening one. The evil spirit was gaining strength, however, for it then toppled a vase of fresh-cut flowers. The next act of phantom vandalism was considerably more serious. Edith could hardly believe her eyes when she found the upholstery of her newly purchased Chesterfield had been slashed, as if with a knife. Devastated by what she took to be Mary's intentional meanness, she confronted the maid and accused her of perpetrating the destruction. Expecting the servant to be defensive, Edith was dumbfounded at the woman's near hysterical reaction. Not only did Mary deny ever having damaged anything in the house, she explained that she had purposely not repaired the destruction so that the bride would be sure to notice it. The malicious acts were meant for Edith's attention, Mary was sure. Now more confused than ever, Edith pressed the woman to explain herself. "You'll have to ask the master, madame," was all the servant would reveal before rushing from the room. Presently, the phone rang. Harry was calling to say that he'd be working late at the office. "Have dinner yourself, my love," he admonished. "And please don't wait up for me. It may be past your bedtime before I get home." With great effort, Edith kept her voice controlled throughout the conversation, and as a result was sure that Harry would have no idea how distressed she was. After a moment's consideration, Edith decided that perhaps a few extra hours alone with Mary might not be a bad thing after all. It might allow her the time to get to the bottom of the disturbing situation in her new home. Towards this end, she called the woman back into the living room. Speaking as kindly and gently as she possibly could, Edith tried to assure Mary that she did want the two of them to be on good terms. "I don't hate you, madame," the maid replied. "I'm content with my place and don't want to leave. It's Mr. Harry, madame. He must stop hating. He counters hate with hate. I've told him many times that he must change his ways, but he's stubborn and won't listen. This evil that you've seen and felt around the house is hate from beyond the grave. Even the strength of the mister's hate can never overpower that. He needs to meet this hate with forgiveness, or there will never be peace in this house." Mary's impassioned explanation was interrupted by a second phone call. The maid left the room to answer the persistent ringing, and when she came back, it was clear to Edith that the woman was even more upset. It seemed that Mary's sister had been involved in an accident and was asking for her. Something in the maid's protestations of innocence in regard to the unusual going-ons must have convinced Edith of her sincerity. And although she knew that she should have let Mary go to her sister, she realized that she was dreading being alone in the house with the evil presence. As she hurried away, Mary reinforced the importance of Edith convincing her husband that he must stop hating. "Just remember, madame, none of this will stop until he's forgiven the person he's hating," Mary reiterated, and she fled from the house. Who must he stop hating and forgive?" Edith shouted as the door slammed. "He'll know," came the reply from the other side of the closed door. Thoroughly confused and quite frightened, Edith sat at the kitchen table eating the sandwich that she would call dinner. Food might calm her, she reasoned. However, just moments later, she felt unseen, icy fingers groping at her. She instantly realized that the evil in the kitchen with her was more than she was capable of counteracting. Fearing for her life, she bolted from the kitchen to the apparent safety of the living room. This room looked so calm and serene that she felt foolish at having been nearly hysterical just moments earlier. She sat at the piano and laid her hands on the familiar arrangement of keys. Playing always soothed her nerves. A second later, she glanced up. Had that shadow always been in the corner of the room? She tried to convince herself that it had, but failed. The evil chortle that the dark presence then emitted was more than she could endure. Screaming senselessly, Edith began to pound out chord after chord on the piano. Soon she realized that the shadow in the corner was lightening somewhat. Her chords became less harsh, more melodic, until she found her fingers playing the familiar notes of a favorite sonata. The sense of the vile presence was now all but gone. Edith played on until she suddenly felt foolish at having allowed herself to become so frightened over what had clearly been nothing at all. Wanting to refresh herself for Harry's return home, she got up from the piano, intending to make her way to the dressing table in their bedroom. The evil spirit that had been driven back by the music seized this moment of silence and vulnerability. Its essence revitalized. Moments later, the phantom was again strong enough that Edith sensed it. She could no longer fight. Collapsing onto the nearest chair, her last fully conscious thought was whether the manifestation of hatred was possibly Mary herself, or whether the maid's warnings had been sincere. Regaining consciousness moments later, Edith remembered that Harry had a gun in the house. She rose to search for it, but was soon driven back by the sheer malevolence that surrounded her. As she watched, the energy began to take on a clearer and clearer form until the image of an angry woman stood in front of her. And that woman was not Mary, but someone whom Edith was sure she'd never seen before. Finding Harry's gun was pointless, the terrified woman realized. Firearms would do no good against this enemy. It was not of this world. Edith could see the apparition clearly, and yet she could also see right through it. Uttering menacingly incomprehensible sounds, the evil image made its way toward Edith, who stood frozen in terror. Hands extended threateningly, the manifestation was almost within reach of strangling her victim when the front door burst open. Harry had arrived home at last. "Louise!" he screamed with evident hate. It was then that Edith recalled the maid's wise counsel. "Don't curse her, Harry, whoever she is. Hating her will only strengthen her powers." "Forgive her, Harry, for whatever wrong she did to you," Edith implored. "Forgive her? How could I? This woman stood me up at the altar and then spread vicious untruths about me throughout our entire circle of friends. How could I possibly forgive her?" Harry demanded. "You must, Harry. If you were to have any peace in our lives, you must forgive this woman's soul," Edith countered. "All right, Louise, I don't hate you any more. Just go. Go from our lives, leave us alone. Go to your final rest," the man ordered. The ghost stood in a shimmering but poised and malevolent stillness. "Forgive her, Harry, forgive her," Edith repeated. For a moment there was silence, then Harry's demeanor softened noticeably. "Edith is right. All this hate has no place in this home now. You wronged me, Lois, but I have no reason now to keep hating you. I forgive you and beg you to go on your final reward and let me get on with life. You and I have no more need of each other," he concluded. As the last of Harry's words hung in the air, the atmosphere began to lighten until the evil spirit had completely dispersed, never returned to that posh home on Uplands Road. This story takes place in Barkerville, British Columbia. Well-haunted Barkerville. Barkerville in east-central British Columbia is a preserved ghost town, a place where visitors can meander through the streets of history. Much of the old town remains standing, haunted, and available to be explored. For the ghost hunter, that means only one thing: lots of haunted buildings to investigate. Like many of the western towns that were established in the 1800s to serve the needs of those chasing instant wealth in the various gold rushes, Barkerville has an intriguing history. In the mid-1800s, Billy Barker, an English sailor, jumped ship and made his way to the interior of British Columbia. There, along with hundreds of others, he searched for the golden motherlode. Unlike many others, Billy Barker did strike it rich. As a matter of fact, he found a great deal of gold and became wealthy beyond his wild imaginings. Barkerville sprang up just south and east of Prince George to supply Barker and other miners in the area. The town flourished for a number of years and was known far and wide as the most law-abiding towns in the West. Such peacefulness was not a result of the citizens' inherent goodness, but simply the town's inaccessible location. Barkerville is out of the way that if a crime was committed, all that was necessary to corner the perpetrator was to seal off the few roads leading out of town. As a result, Barkerville wasn't nearly as rowdy a place as most mining towns. Despite its placid past, Barkerville was haunted already even when it was a burgeoning community. Today it is still home to at least 3 ghosts, but it was a ghostly appearance during the town's heyday that was the most remarkable manifestation. Wellington Moses operated Barkerville's barber shop. With very little effort beyond opening the shop, he created a successful business and became friendly with many of his customers, including Morgan Blessing, a wealthy and flamboyant American. Blessing had not been raised with money and liking to show off what he had acquired, wore distinctive gold jewelry made from nuggets that he had mined. In no time at all, Blessing and Moses became fast friends. Soon they met a third man, James Barry, an unscrupulous fellow who saw the friendship between Moses and Blessing as an opportunity to enrich his pocketbook. Barry planned on and succeeded in causing conflict between the two friends. Soon tensions ran so high that on their way back from a trip to the coast, Moses left the other two and went on ahead. Not long after the barber had settled back into his home and shop in Barkerville, he heard that James Barry was also back in town. Morgan Blessing, however, was not. Interestingly, Barry's personal wealth had grown astronomically in just a few short days. Wellington Moses was deeply concerned by this turn of events, but beyond his own suspicions, there was no evidence that anything illegal had occurred. After all, Morgan Blessing was an adult. If he decided to move on to another town rather than return to Barkerville, it was really no one's business but his own. By the same token, James Barry might have come by his new wealth honestly. There was no evidence to the contrary so far. Several weeks later, Moses was shocked to see his old friend Morgan Blessing struggling in through the front door of his barber shop. The man looked much the worse for wear. His clothes were ripped and muddy, his complexion pasty, his eyes bloodshot. Barely able to make his way to the barber chair, Blessing indicated to Moses that he wanted a shave. Speechless with both relief at seeing Blessing again and concern for the man's obvious distress, Moses set about preparing to give the man the shave that he requested. He wrapped Blessing's face in a warm, moist towel before turning to sharpen the razor that he planned to use. When just a few seconds later, Wellington Moses glanced back at his friend, he saw a sight that he'd never forget. The towel that he placed on his friend's face was soaked with blood. Seconds later, the man's image vanished. Only the blood-stained towel remained. To Moses, it was clear evidence that a foul and fatal deed had been committed and needed to be avenged. Despite this apparent plea from beyond the grave, there was little that Moses could do to prove that James Barry had murdered and robbed Morgan Blessing. Several weeks later, Blessing's remains were found with a single bullet hole in the back of his head. It was now clear that he'd been murdered, but the body alone did nothing to implicate James Barry in any way. Barry's connection with the crime went unproven until a Barkerville woman began showing off an unusual pin, explaining that Barry had given it to her. By the middle of the following summer, James Barry had been accused, tried, found guilty of murder, and hanged. Presumably Morgan's Blessing's spirit found solace in this justice, for his ghost was never seen in Barkerville again. Had Mr. Blessing cared to drop in on Barkerville a second time after his death, he would not have been lonely, for even today there are ghosts in the town. Madame Fanny Bendixson still looks out a second-floor window of the building that housed her saloon. The image is so lifelike that visitors assumed that the manifestation is one of the site's historic interpreters. Not so. There is never any living person on the second floor of the old building because, since the staircase collapsed many years ago, there is no way to get to that level. From descriptions of the off-scene apparition and records of Fanny Bendixson's appearance, it is clear that the woman's spirit has stayed behind to keep a watchful eye on what was once her business. Another haunted building in Barkerville is much more puzzling. Barkerville's Theatre Royal of today is not an original building, but merely a replica. Despite this lack of authentic history, the place is definitely home to ghosts. Footfalls are routinely heard making their way across the stage floor when no one can be seen anywhere near that area. Furthermore, isolated pockets of cold air, which are generally acknowledged as indicative of the presence of a spirit in a building, have been noted throughout the theater. Music has been heard coming from the theater's speakers, even when no power was connected to them. And during productions in the theater, apparitions have turned up on the stage, especially frequently at stage left. That's where performers report seeing the image of a man dressed in formal attire from the 19th century. In the split second that it takes the startled people to realize that there shouldn't be anyone in that location, the image vanishes. Over the years, that particular ghost's appearance have been reported with amazing consistency. He's described by all who've seen him as sporting a top hat, tails, and a mustache. No one knows who the long-deceased dandy might be. Just that when he's seen, he's always in the same location and attire. Perhaps before and after he makes his appearance to the living, he relaxes with Fanny at the saloon, or with the town's phantom piano player, who is yet another ghostly resident of Barkerville. And so among ghost towns, Barkerville is something of an exception in that more than just the buildings have been preserved, even the spirit of the place lives on. This story takes place in Penticton, BC. The Blue Lady. Some called her Sophia, and others used the more general descriptor, the Blue Lady. Regardless of what name they knew her by, those who worked in the museum in the sunny Okanagan city of Penticton readily acknowledged the ghost's presence. The apparition was once actually sighted standing beside a display. At other times, however, witnesses saw only a vague blue haze or heard the rustling of the skirts of her period costume. They reported feeling a female presence in the room, a feeling that their eyesight could not confirm. There were also sudden, unaccounted-for pockets of cold air felt throughout the building, as well as the sounds of footsteps when there was no one visible. The haunting came to an abrupt end in 1992 when the staff examined a box that had been stored in the building. Writing on the outside of the curtain indicated only that the contents had been found on the east side of the river. The investigators were understandably concerned when they discovered that the articles inside were bones, human bones. The proper authorities were notified immediately. A closer examination revealed that the bones were from not just one skeleton, but they had come from 2 women and 1 man. Much to the staff's collective relief, the spectre has not been detected in the Penticton Museum since that box of bones was removed from the property. Penticton is not the only place in British Columbia with a Blue Lady. There is also an entity of the same color in Victoria. This Blue Lady has been seen at the Point Ellis house on Pleasant Street, which was bought by Magistrate and Mrs. Peter O'Reilly in 1868. One of their daughters, Kathleen O'Reilly, never married and resided in this home for her entire life, and apparently for at least the first 30 years following her death. Point Ellis House, no longer a private home, is now a museum and tea room operated by the provincial government. Kathleen's spirit hasn't been seen too often since the house passed out of her descendants' hands, but in years gone by, unsuspecting visitors to the house have sometimes enjoyed a guided tour led by an extremely knowledgeable and gentle woman wearing an old-fashioned blue dress and bearing a remarkable resemblance to Kathleen. When their very thorough tour was over, the guests were most credulous to find that the only guide working that day was busy with another group, and looked very different from the woman who'd so proudly shown them around. After the ghost of Kathleen took two men on a tour of Point Ellis house one day, they reported that she followed them out to the street and on down the road before simply disappearing. This story takes place in Victoria, British Columbia. The Haunted Todd House. Anyone who knew him might well have named him John Todd, as the most unforgettable character they had ever met. Todd was undeniably a strong and unique personality. As a young man, he had left a safe, secure home in Scotland for whatever adventures Canada might have to offer. Todd was a trader for the Hudson Bay Company, and most of his activities during his life were enmeshed with business. Along the way, he married several times. Some say that he had 4 wives. Others maintain that he married as many as 7 times. It is known that Todd sired a total of 10 children with the various Mrs. Todds. When he retired, John Todd chose to do so in Victoria. He purchased 186 hectares, 460 acres, of prime real estate just a short distance from Oak Bay, on which to build his spacious retirement home. Land was a lot less expensive then, for the year was 1851. John Todd died at home in 1882, at the age of 94. He was an agnostic who had given specific orders for no funeral be held in his honor. Sophia, his wife at that time, was a devout Christian and couldn't bring herself to comply with her husband's wishes. She had her husband interred with a full Christian ceremony. Supernatural activity in Todd House began shortly afterward. Dishes would rattle noisily in the cupboards. Jars hung from hooks on the wall and would rock back and forth. Doors that would open would slam close. Doors that were closed would swing open. Clothes hung on racks would be flung about. An unoccupied rocking chair rocked back and forth as though someone was sitting in it. Footsteps and indistinct voices were heard throughout the place. Colonel and Mrs. Evans, who bought the house in 1944, may have been shown just how strongly John Todd or his ghost felt about Christian festivals when they decorated their newly purchased home for Christmas. They awoke on Christmas Day to find the holiday decorations that they had lovingly set out stripped from their walls and the tree and piled neatly in the center of the living room floor. The Evanses soon discovered other inconveniences associated with living in the big old place. There was one room that no one liked to go into. Privately, the Evanses called it the Eerie Room. They felt that it was constantly and inexplicably colder than the rest of the house. On one occasion, guests who had been put up in that room hurriedly left before dawn. They had seen an apparition, a particularly unnerving apparition. To them had appeared an image of a dark-haired woman bound in chains and leg irons, gesturing soundlessly for help. Evidently, John Todd's spirit was not the only one prowling about their home. In another incident involving the Eerie Room, the window, which had been nailed closed for some time, crashed out of its frame onto the lawn below when no one visible was near it. The mess left behind is said to have looked as though someone had tried to escape from the room. The Evanses' suspicions about there being another ghost at large were confirmed in 1952. Workers whom they had hired to convert the home's heating system to oil made a grisly discovery. There, over 2 meters, 7 feet below the ground level, in the excavation that the laborers had dug for the oil tank, lay a human skeleton. Examination confirmed that these remains were of a native woman. Her body had decomposed quickly, probably as a result of liberal amounts of lime being thrown into her makeshift grave. John's wife before Sophia had been a dark-haired woman. Local historians recalled being told that she had gone insane and that Todd had locked her up in a certain room of his home. The same eerie room in which the guests had seen the apparition of the captive woman. The skeleton was immediately removed from its unmarked grave, and for the most part, the haunting of Todd House ended. However, back in 1950, before that discovery, Vancouver Sun journalist Chris Crombie and George Vipond decided to spend a night in the Todd House. They hoped to meet the ghost and then report on their adventures. Although they saw nothing, they came away convinced that the spirits in at least one house were not completely at rest. As the two tried to settle in for the night, they heard the front gate outside the house open and then close. Crombie and Vipond listened to the sounds of footsteps walking up the path towards the house. Presuming that they were about to have visitors, they prepared to answer the door. When no one knocked, the pair looked outside. No one was there. If that incident unnerved them, it was well that the investigators did not know. What surprises that night held in store for them. There were mysterious muffled thumps, a pitter-patter that sounded like bare feet on wood, a faint but definite musical tinkle, they recalled. They concluded that at the time of their stay, nearly 17 years after the original homeowner's death, at the very least, Todd House still had the strangest atmosphere of a long legendary past that wraps the oak-beamed rooms in a mysterious shroud. Perhaps it might be less colorful, but more concise to say that the Todd House was haunted. This story takes place in Victoria, British Columbia. Persistent Presences. World-renowned artist Emily Carr was born at her parents' estate on Victoria's Government Street in 1871, not far from the site of George Nia's haunted house. Both the woman herself and Emily Carr House have given rise to some intriguing ghost stories. In her autobiography, Emily notes that she was a contrary child who did not seek out the company of other children. Instead, she preferred to spend her time with the farm animals on the property or simply roaming about alone. In common with many solitary children, young Emily adopted an invisible friend, who often accompanied her on her explorations. This companion was so real to Emily that years later, as an adult, she reflected on the possibility that her companion was actually a ghost, and not just the product of her own imagination. I always wondered if it was a spirit of a young boy who joined me, she attested. The Carr's original land has since been subdivided. What remains with the house today is only a fraction of the original size, but the family home still stands. Some people believe it to be haunted. My own experience while visiting Emily Carr House has made me one of those people. I'd look forward to visiting the house from the moment that I planned my trip to Victoria. Not only was I hoping for a ghost story, but my interest in Canadian art history made Emily Carr House at 207 Government Street a must-see. Seconds after I walked into the house, I asked a staff member whether or not it was haunted. She smiled enigmatically and suggested that I tour the house and come back to report my impressions. Even though I don't claim to be physically sensitive, I accepted the challenge and began to explore various rooms. I thoroughly enjoyed poking about the main floor, but sensed nothing out of the ordinary. As soon as I climbed the stairs, however, I felt uncomfortable, as though I was intruding into someone else's space. Although my urge was to escape the sensation by retreating to the main floor, I'd waited a long time to visit Emily's birthplace and was determined to at least complete my tour. Emily's parents' bedrooms are on display and look as if they would have when the family was living in the house. Although the public is invited to walk right into Miss Carr's bedroom, I found that I wasn't able to. A sense that it was someone else's personal space was just too strong, and I went back downstairs immediately. After waiting a moment to compose myself, I approached the woman I'd spoken to earlier. She smiled and acknowledged that Emily Carr House is indeed haunted, but not by Emily. It is the ghost of Emily Carr's mother that has remained. Apparently, as a youngster, Emily was afraid to climb the staircase at night. To ease the child's fear, her mother used to stand at the top of the stairs while the child made her way up. That anecdote certainly explained the protective presence that I had detected as I climbed the stairs. Emily's mother bedroom is the only other area in the house thought to be haunted. Although Miss Carr died in 1886, her spirit has not entirely left her former home. But what of the spirit of the artist herself? Although her ghost has never been seen in her childhood home, her spirit hasn't completely left the city where she spent much of her life. The ghost of Emily Carr is often seen at nearby St. Anne's Academy, a historic site that previously served as a girls' school and as a convent. In one such incident in 1992, Victoria resident Greg Hartnell saw her image, and his sighting was later confirmed by a second witness. James Fry, a cable television producer, had previously seen Carr's apparition in November 1991, while scouting for filming locations. The encounter took place in the early evening. Fry watched in fascination as the ghost image appeared at a window in the otherwise vacant St. Anne's. Apparently open-minded to the concept of ghost, the producer expressed interest in possibly interviewing the ghost on television. Unfortunately, the spirit did not cooperate. A year earlier, retired businessman Arthur Knight reported to the newspaper that he'd seen two hooded figures at St. Anne's just as dawn was breaking. The man had the good fortune to have a camera with him at the time and quickly snapped a shot that later confirmed his observations. It would seem that in death, at least, Emily Carr is not alone. This story takes place in Victoria, British Columbia. Is the gallery's ghost gone? The province has had at least one other haunted art gallery, this one in the city of Victoria. The personable and popular THRU was the curator of the Norfolk Gallery on Broad Street until his death in the 1950s. When a new administrator, Katie Bloomfield, took over responsibility for the displays, she soon recognized that Mr. Hare had not really left the building. At first, Bloomfield simply felt her predecessor's presence. The effect on her was predictable. She had the feeling that the hair on the back of her neck was standing up, and as she became more used to being in the haunted building, the ghost strength increased, and she could often make out a misty form of a man's shape hovering near the room that had been Theo Hare's office. After a few years, for reasons not related to the entity, Katie Bloomfield sold the gallery to a couple named Chris and Elma Phillips. The couple had a 4-year-old boy. As is often the case, the child could see the ghostly image much more clearly and much more frequently than his parents could. It was also typical that the parents were concerned about Hare's visits from beyond, whereas the boy was accepting and even welcoming of the occasional guest. The Phillips family left the Broad Street address in the early 1960s. The building is no longer an art gallery, and as far as has been reported, it is no longer haunted. Perhaps the ghost's interest in the building finally died out when the art displays left.